Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Odessa Warren, and on behalf of Ibraaz, I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation today to mark the opening of Cosmic Breath by artist Joe Namy. This installation also marks the opening of our third floor, the Musalla, which some of you might have gone to see. I hope you have. It's a space dedicated to both spiritual practice and creative expression, and it just opened on Thursday, so it's a brand new space for us this week. I also just want to say quickly that I know this is a very difficult day for a lot of us with the news, so all the more reason to thank you for being here. So I'm delighted to introduce Joe Namy, a Lebanese-American artist and composer whose work explores the cultural and political life of sound, often looking at how music, listening, and sound systems shape space, community, and collective experience. It's also a real pleasure to also have architect Sumayya Vally with us today, whose thinking around space, ritual, and gathering has been central not only to this work, but also to the wider conversations we are having at Ibraaz about art, spirituality, and the architectures that shape collective experience. So today we'll spend some time unpacking the work and the collaboration behind it, specifically between Joe and Sumayya, and also the broader questions it raises. And as always, we'll have some time for questions at the end, so please do stick around. So I think to just kick us off, Joe, it would be wonderful if you could just tell us a bit about Cosmic Breath, describe maybe what people see when they encounter and experience it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, can you hear me? Oh, sorry, give me the mic. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Odessa, for that nice introduction. Thank you to Ibraaz for hosting this, and thanks to everybody coming out on, a difficult and dark day. I'm supposed to fly to Beirut tomorrow, so I'm a bit frazzled, so please bear with us. But it's nice to be in community with everybody and talking with everybody. So Cosmic Breath is it is an installation that is situated in the Musalla on the third floor, so the third floor of the space. And it's a sound piece that is both meant to be functional as well as an artwork as well. And it's all around the call to prayer, the adhan. And basically, it's looking at the kind of like the poetics, the politics, and the power of the call to prayer. With the idea that, at any given time in the world, there's a call to prayer happening somewhere. There's always this constant with infinite variations that's being called. And so the piece itself revolves around is situated or based around the speakers that you would normally see at the top of minarets and mosques that would be used for the call to prayer. And they're normally very distant, they're normally very loud, but for this installation, they're you can see it behind here. So this is a picture from the first installation that was done in Saudi for the Islamic Biennale. This installation had 18 speakers. The one upstairs, it's a smaller space, more intimate, more warmer, only has 10 speakers. And each speaker has a different call to prayer that we collected from across time and space, specifically looking at kind of more unconventional calls to prayers that you wouldn't really expect to hear. And maybe we can talk a little bit later about what the recordings are and how we source them. But just to say that because it is a functional piece, the audience, you guys are invited to actually use the space as a prayer room, as a meditation room, as a space to reflect or hang out or just get away from the city. And because of that, we had to be intentional about how the sound worked in the space, because it is a very distinct sounds. So the soundtrack is basically a synchronized version of the call to prayer from all these different recordings that we collected. And they're all synced up so every phrase starts together at the same time, and then you hear the different kinds of flourishes and improvisations that happen for each unique call to prayer. And it's played on loop throughout the day, but very quietly, because the intention was for the city itself, for it to sound like just kind of like soft background. Like you would hear, for instance, like if I was in Beirut, if I was in my house in Beirut, when the call to prayer happens, you just kind of hear it wafting very softly. And that's kind of how it functions in this space, aside from set prayer times when it becomes activated and becomes louder during the prayer time, and then goes back to looping and quiet. And so you're encouraged to really get close to the speakers to hear each individual recording. You kind of got to stick your head inside the speaker to hear them. And then you can kind of step back and hear it all together really softly.
Thank you, Joe. So I think also it'd be really just interesting to speak about how the work came to be and a bit about its conception and the conversations behind it. So Sumayya, as part of your curatorial vision and the work that you did for the first Islamic Arts Biennale in 2023, of which you were the artistic director, you actually commissioned this piece in conversation with Joe, and those are the installation views that we're seeing on the screen. And so this is the second ever kind of presentation of the work, and it's been adapted for the space here at Ibraaz. But Sumayya, could you just say a bit more about the inception and your vision for the Biennale and how you saw that Joe's work speaking to how you were thinking about the adhan specifically?
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. As Joe said, and as Odessa said, I think that it is really special to be together on this day and to be with community, and also to be inaugurating this work that is so much also about resistance, resilience of people, and people coming together despite so much. When we first started to think about the work, it was in the context of the first Islamic Arts Biennale. And as artistic director of the first edition, I also had the task of, really thinking about what an Islamic Arts Biennale is and should be. I'm not a traditional Islamic scholar, and I was very aware of that. I was also very lucky to be working alongside incredible Islamic scholars, as well as an archaeologist, Dr. Sada Rashid, Dr. Amni Abdelbar, and Dr. Julian Raby. And so what I really wanted to think about in this Biennale is to foreground practices, rituals that come from our worlds, to think about the methods of practice that are grounded in them, and to unpack the way that we see the world from our perspectives, from our faith, from our philosophies, and to be able to really reckon with and realize that there are entire creative universes waiting to happen from our perspectives. And when I was thinking about the constellation of artists and artist methods and practices, of course, many people said, does an Islamic Arts Biennale mean that you're only working with Muslim artists? And for us to define who and what is a Muslim is also, I think, not in the ethos of what the project is about. What I really wanted to do was to think about methods of practice that come from the faith, or that are resonant with the way that we practice. And I was interested in artists who are working orally, artists who work with archives, that are resonant with forms of our cultures, and where those archives are embodied. So, really thinking about sound practices, about food, about forms of gathering and the knowledges that they hold. And we had artists work on bodies of research in relation to historic objects and artifacts, as well as archaeological research. But the story of Joe and I and this work precedes that. And so I will talk a little bit about that. When I worked on the Serpentine Pavilion in 2021, the pavilion was a reckoning with and a recognition of places across London that became home for migrant communities when they first moved here. So some of the first mosques, African churches, synagogues, marketplaces that hold traditional ingredients. And the design of the pavilion folded these places into the pavilion in Kensington Gardens. But then we also had fragments of the pavilion that we placed in community arts institutions across London. And one of them was at the Valence Library in Barking and Dagenham. And at that fragment, we inaugurated a radio station that also tied into and was in recognition of the Serpentines' long commitment through their civic program with that institution. And Joe was the resident artist who inaugurated a permanent radio station. And for the inauguration of the radio station, Joe invited myself and Brian Eno to bring samples for our audience to listen to. And I remember really thinking about, we were kind of at the end of COVID, but it was a time when we were really all thinking and talking about the ways that we come together. And both in relation to the pavilion and Joe's work and being far away from home, I brought a sample from Hugh Masekela, who's a South African jazz musician, and it was the sound of his voice imitating the sound of a steam train. And he was describing people going into the coal mines on the steam train. And I brought it in relation to Joe's practice because the song itself has a very metallic sound that is inspired by the sound of the steam train. And for the second piece, I brought a sound clip from an activist who had just recently passed, right before the listening session. His name is Ibraaz Ramdas, and he was a community activist in South Africa. And there are incredible videos that I saw on Facebook at the time, which is the sample that I brought to the listening session, where there was this community in Durban in Isipingo Beach during COVID, and there was a call to ban the adhan from being played loudly from mosques in Isipingo Beach. And in response, the community around that area, initiated by non-Muslims and really initiated by Ibraaz himself, came together in protest. And how they protested was they installed loudspeakers, very much like the one that Joe has in his installation, on top of their cars and drove through the neighborhood, all tuned into the adhan in the same radio station frequency. And it was this incredibly moving, beautiful protest to watch because it brought together interfaith solidarity. And also, I think just the cleverness of it architecturally, I was also really taken by, that these people were moving in procession in their cars in a very resourceful DIY way, making use of the sound systems in their cars and thinking about the inhabitation of space as something that is also oral and atmospheric and not necessarily tied to a specific location. This idea that you can't ban us from carrying what we carry in our bodies and in our movement was very powerful. And I was very sad to hear about the passing of Ibraaz. So I brought this sample to the listening session. But I was also particularly interested in it in relation to Joe's practice because Joe works with car sound systems. I'm from Johannesburg. I grew up in Lodium, where all the boys go to the gas station, and sound system from cars and the way that people operate them from car boots or car trunks is very much a part of the culture. And I know that that's something that's very resonant with Detroit and also Beirut, and something that's very much in Joe's practice. So that was the origin of our first conversation. And in the context of the Biennale, the journey of how we moved through the narrative of the Biennale was from the scale of the atomic, so the scale of the sound of the call to prayer, the atom, to the scale of the infinite. So as we moved through the Biennale, we went from the sound of the call to prayer to the body and the limbs in the state of wudu or ablution, to salah, the body in prayer, the many bodies in prayer, and then the scale of the infinite, this moment when we had an artist who worked with the Kaaba door and oral inscriptions of its size. And that was really about this idea that every time we stand up and face the Qibla, we're in an infinite gathering. Joe's work opened the Biennale. It was the very first work that we walked into. And for me, it was so powerful because it brought all of these scales together. Of course, it is the scale of the atom and the particle of sound, but it is also the infinite. And Mu'ad Misbahi, who was in the curatorial team, thought about this theme and title of Cosmic Breath as well, which is this idea that every second, or resonates with the idea that every second of the day, the call to prayer is being called somewhere on earth. And when we stand up and respond to the call, we connect with people who have been responding across time. So if you have an image of it in your head, the call is being called with the movement of the sun, and there are 5 a day, so it moves across the world. And as we respond, we're also standing up and responding from the time of Bilal, who was the first person who called the adhan, with everybody present at the moment across the world who is responding, and everybody who is yet to come who will respond in the future. So the atomic and the infinite.
Thank you, Sumayya, for such a rich and generous answer and background into the kind of thinking and inception of the work. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said, and I think maybe let's take it step by step. And so I just want to pick up on this idea, which is in Cosmic Breath, and I think the way that both of you speak about the work, which is this idea of the azan as this unifying sonic practice across time and across space. We've got in the first iteration like 18 different recordings from as early as the 1800s, with the first recording of the call to prayer in Mecca, through to contemporary calls, and also very different kind of context. So we've got mosques, but also this idea of which you spoke about, which I think is an incredibly interesting example and important case, which is the call to prayer as a protest sound in Durban when it was sort of banned, to be played publicly. And I mean, we've got another context, a new introduction, like a new sound that Joe's added, that you've added to the iteration in London, which is during COVID. The first public call to prayer that was amplified, because it's not amplified in London, in this country, but there was an exception made during COVID and during the first lockdown in 2020, where the Waltham Forest Islamic Association actually projected it, and it became this reminder of a shared experience, a shared sonic practice in a moment of like serious isolation. So I think it would be really interesting for us to hear a bit more from you, Joe, about the different recordings, how you went about that research, because we've got field and archival recordings, and the kind of how do we also think about diversity, right? Because there's such a range of contexts and places. So this idea of sonic practice across different sonic environments, and how actually that is really showcased in the different recordings.
Yeah, I can talk about that. How many people have seen the installation? Has anybody actually seen? Come up, a few of you. I encourage you to go up and listen afterwards. It's up until 6, I think, today. But yeah, for this iteration, I mean, the process was, again, it was very overwhelming at first to think about because of how many adhans there are happening, an infinite amount, you know. And so it's like, okay, how do we frame it? How do we narrow it down? How do we think about which ones to include within the installation? And it quickly became clear to me that I was more interested in the ones that were more unconventional recordings, or recordings that you normally wouldn't have access to or be able to hear. Because it just it was, and to think about it in the sense that each one could be symbolic of these kind of wider issues as well. That was very intentional in which recordings went where. It's not so important that you, the listener, the person knows directly the intention behind that. I think it just comes across in the piece as well. But we can talk about, for instance, there's I was interested in looking historically at the adhan, because there's it is this fixed constant thing, and that there's a set phrase that happens, but then it's up to each muezzin to interpret that phrase however they want within certain rules or certain kind of dynamics. But improvisation is a big part of that, the call to prayer. And so on one level, it was important to think about the variations and make that come through, the infinite variations on this unified thing. But then also thinking about the history of it. So like you mentioned, the very first call to prayer that was ever recorded in the late 1800s, the very first, the earliest field recording from the Philippines in the 40s, so that it's not such a common type of recording that you would normally hear. But for that recording, you hear a very different type of inflection or phrasing than the first call to prayer in Mecca, the first recorded call to prayer. Another one was a recording from the first mosque that used loudspeakers to project the sound in the 1930s, which was in Singapore, in the Sultan Mosque. And that's now commonplace, but before it was, you would normally just yell it. You would, they would actually be on top of the minaret and just kind of project their voice out. But now it's pretty common to have that. But we do include the natural call to prayer as well, from a recording that was taken in the Sahrawi refugee camp in Algeria. And so you hear that type of call to prayer as well. And then, and I should also point out that it was important that the recordings are not like the muezzins, the people who do the call to prayer. It wasn't like recording them in a studio. The recordings are all field recordings, and so it was important to take the sounds of the city as well from where it's recorded, how you would hear it from the street or how you'd hear it from, because the place was equally important as the actual call to happen as well. And so you do hear elements, like there's one from Kaga, Japan that we included, really beautiful recording of this man who just recorded himself doing the call to prayer in the middle of the forest to nobody. But you hear the sounds of the nature come in. There was another recording we didn't end up using, but you had sounds of like the Red Sea waves coming in. It was like, we used it for this, the iteration in Saudi, but we didn't use it for this one. And then there's other recordings that we collected. For instance, I was thinking about the first mosque in South America, which was in Brazil. And that mosque it's still there, but it doesn't do the public call to prayer. So we recorded just the ambience, the environment during the call to prayer time, just like the nature, the street. We didn't end up using it, but there were a lot of things that we collected along the way that helped inform the overall project.
Thank you so much, Joe. I wanted to bring the conversation to this idea of gathering and social practices, community practices, which I think are really resonant in both of your work. both of your practices, you think about these things quite deeply. So maybe Sumayya, could you talk to us a little bit more about not only your idea of gathering in your practice, but also how you've thought about Ibraaz. So for those of you who don't know, Sumayya Vally is our resident architect here at Ibraaz and thinking with us about how to shape the spaces that we have here, and has been central to our thinking about the Musalla, which we've just opened. And your phrase that we've been using as a team is this idea of Ibraaz as a space for a gathering of gatherings. So this idea of also multiplicity, multitudes. So I wondered if you could just expand a bit on your idea of gathering, not only through cosmic breath, but also in your wider practice and also for here at Ibraaz.
Yes, thank you so much. I say this, I think I've been lucky to be on the Ibraaz platform a few times as resident architect, and I say this every time, but for me it is so incredible to be a part of Ibraaz's community and to find a home here. So thank you so much to all of the Ibraaz team. I'm so lucky that we are now family. Genuinely. And I think, seeing all of you here using the space that the Kamal Azhar Foundation, Lena, Shuman, Hamad, and all of the team worked so hard to conceptualize and initiate is really incredible. So thank you for being here again. So to come back to the idea of a gathering of gatherings, I think in the way that Lena and Shuman first presented Ibraaz as the institution to me when I came on board as resident architect, they really were very keen to think about this platform as a space that had different formats for exhibition. So we were thinking about spaces where we don't come in and look at an exhibition, but that we come in to be with an exhibition or to be with work. And in the way that Lena and Shuman described how exhibitions would unfold, they are thematically also thinking about forms and forums of gathering. So the Majlis space, for example, where we just closed Ibrahim Mahama's work that was curated by Shuman. There, for example, Ibrahim's work, The Parliament of Ghosts, using this as an example, convenes people and is used on a daily basis for discussions, debates. It is used for performances and events. And when it's not being activated, of course, it is an artwork in and of its own right to come and visit. And I was really inspired by that idea and started to think about how we design the spaces like that as well. So, for example, in Ola, our cafe space, which currently houses Buthena bin Salim's cafe, is really inspired by this idea of Ola. And when Buthena explained it to us, she said it's a very long surface where many women come together and dry herbs and spices, come to prepare harvest rituals and ingredients. And I really love this idea of this unfolding surface. And so the way that we designed the cafe was really thinking about an unfolding surface that could have multiple configurations. And, in the same way that in many of the ways that we gather from our cultures, in Tunisia with Mida, which are small coffee tables, or in my culture, when we have a dasturkhan on the floor, a surface unrolled on the floor, there is a larger gathering, and within that there are also moments for intimacy. We thought about this with the way that the cafe tables are configured. And throughout the experience of the building, we wanted to think about how we draw on a different logic of gathering for how people come together. In the Musalla space, I was really also excited and interested in thinking about this idea of a piece that would be functional. For the first iteration of the Musalla, it's very important to say that, of course, the Musalla is actively in use already, even before it opened and while it was still being fitted out by our community for daily prayer, but it is a multi-faith space and it's open to everyone. But as soon as we started thinking about the space, I called Joe, and we started to think about this idea of how the work could have two translations, one that would be across the day and one that would be activated during prayer time as a marker that it is prayer time. Many of us grew up with devices in our homes that told us when it is the adhan. But also I think in a city like London, it's very powerful that we do have this work. And when I walked into it this afternoon, I told Joe that it takes me right back to being in my hometown, in Lodium in South Africa, where we have the choreography of the adhan loud in the street from many different mosques overlapping at the same time. And to be able to have that experience in London through this work is incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sumayya. I mean, just to add to that, I think, you know, what you were saying, Joe, earlier about having the sound on actually as a whisper, almost like a murmur, it blends with the sound of the outside, the cars, the city, the bustle and the hustle and bustle of Oxford Circus.
Mm-hmm.
And what that creates is this sense of the azan actually blending into the soundscape of the city, and it reminds me of back home as well. So I hear you on how, you know, that experience of the work kind of brings you back to a sense of home for those of us who are from cities and places that actually, you know, project the azan. And I think also, thank you for also bringing attention to what the Musalla as a space is and who it's for and how it's meant to be used. I think, you know, before we even announced anything about opening a space like this, we had a lot of audience, visitors coming to Ibraaz and asking for a space to pray. And a lot of my colleagues and community members have actually explained to us as a team or to myself that there are very few spaces to pray in central London. And so actually there was a kind of a need for this, and there's been such a wonderful kind of response just since Thursday. I mean, we did a little artist talk with Joe. We had a few people in the room already on Thursday morning, and people were so happy to see a space like this that is at once one for artistic practice, for creative expression, but that can also be used in a non-prescriptive way, but as a space that is welcoming, right? For that kind of practice and expression and meditation. So yeah, Joe, I kind of want to bring this back to you now as well, because I know that community gathering and specifically how sound can actually enable that space of gathering and community is really central to your work and central to a lot of your other projects, specifically thinking about sound systems, cars, your work at Sharjah as well, your work on the underground here in London, your work with broadcasting. So I wanted to bring the question to you about how you kind of see this in your practice, and specifically around the question of technology, right? Because you think a lot about the sound system, you're thinking about this kind of specific infrastructure, sonic infrastructure of the horn, this very recognizable speaker that we find on minarets of mosques across the world. So I wondered if you could kind of expand on that in your practice.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like the cornerstone of that piece upstairs is the piece that the protest that you mentioned, the car protest with the adhan on the speakers, and that kind of that was like the genesis of the project, and it kind of encapsulates like the how to think about that the whole project in a way, and so much of my work is what I'm really interested in is a lot about looking at the spirituality of sound systems and the power that they hold, whether that's the sound systems for projecting the adhan or like a car stereo that somebody has that cranks it up and you can hear it from like blocks away, or like the Jamaican sound system culture that's so prevalent here in London as well. And all these sound systems are meant to like bring people together, to congregate people, to make us feel more connected to each other in so many different ways. And I'm just more interested. I'm really interested in that type of connection and that type of power that these systems have of amplifying sound in these very unique these very unique ways.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to maybe bring the event to an end. We've lost quite a few people, but thank you everyone so much for coming. It's been a really rich afternoon. Thank you to Joe and Sumayya for your generosity, your thoughts, your care, and thank you to the team as always, Emma Buraba, Barnaby Davis, Sarah Hamid, Lina Lazar, Hamad Nasser, Fiona Duffy. The team's amazing here. It doesn't happen without them. And one final very quick reflection note is that we're open until 6. So if any of you want to go up to the Musalla, you're more than welcome to. For those who are observing Ramadan Kareem, if you'd like to break your fast here, we have water and dates outside. You're more than welcome to them. And yeah, please do visit the Musalla on your way out. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Joe.
Odessa.
And thank you, Odessa. Congratulations, Joe and Odessa.